At 10:30 a.m. on the 15th of October 1965, the last passenger train from the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway pulled away from the depot on Main Street in Ashton, Kansas. The station agent, a man named Harold Vogel who had worked there for 32 years, watched the final car disappear around the curve. He walked inside, pulled the depot door shut, and locked it for good. The platform was empty. The tracks would be pulled up within the month. That moment marked more than the end of a service. It was the signal that a way of life had already begun to disappear. Ashton was a town of just under 3,000 people set in the rolling wheat country of north-central Kansas. Like hundreds of other towns settled in the 1880s, it had been born because of the railroad. The tracks arrived first, laid by crews moving west, and the town grew around the depot. Main Street ran parallel to the rails, a single block of brick and clapboard buildings that housed a dry goods store, a hardware shop, a bank, a doctor's office, a hotel, and a weekly newspaper. For 70 years, the rhythm of Ashton was tied to the trains. The morning freight brought mail, fresh produce, and lumber. The passenger train 2 times a day carried farmers to market, children to school in the county seat, and traveling salesmen with samples in their trunks. The depot was the town's front door. When Harold Vogel locked it, the town lost its connection to the wider world. What happened to Ashton happened to thousands of towns across America. The story of Main Street is not one single event but a slow, cumulative process that began decades earlier and accelerated after World War II. The passenger train was not the first piece to go. It was simply the most visible. The deeper causes had been building since the 1800s, when automobiles started replacing horses and streetcars, when roads began to be paved, and when federal policy quietly shifted the nation's focus from rails to rubber. The first sign of change came as early as 1927, when the Lincoln Highway, a transcontinental route, was rerouted to pass 3 miles north of Ashton. Local merchants pushed for a spur road, but state highway funds were limited. By 1935, a new paved U.S. Highway Route 24 ran along the old Lincoln alignment, bypassing Main Street entirely. The town did not die that year, but the traffic that had once rolled through the center of Ashton now hummed along a blacktop strip to the north, where a gas station and a diner appeared. The diner's owner, a man named Frank Bowen, did a brisk business. He had been one of the few to see the future. He bought the land before the highway was built, and his establishment became the first piece of what would later be called a strip development. For a while, Main Street held its own. The trains still came. The stores still served the surrounding farms. The bank still issued loans for seed and equipment. But the seeds of decline were planted in the 1940s and 1950s when the federal government embarked on the largest infrastructure project in American history, the interstate highway system. The 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, signed by President Eisenhower, promised 41,000 miles of limited-access highways. For small towns, the interstate was both a lifeline and a noose. It connected them to markets, but it also made it easy for shoppers to leave and for chain stores to arrive without ever setting foot on Main Street. In Ashton, the interstate arrived in 1960. Interstate 70 was built 15 miles to the south, connecting Denver and Kansas City. The town suddenly had fast access to cities, but the exit ramp was not at Main Street. It was placed at the junction with the old state highway, several miles west of the depot. A truck stop, a motel, and a supermarket went up at that exit. The supermarket was part of a regional chain. It sold the same goods as the hardware store and the dry goods store, but at lower prices and with more variety. Customers from Ashton began driving the 15 minutes to the exit for their weekly shopping. The stores on Main Street saw their foot traffic drop. One by one, they closed. At 3:30 p.m. on the 17th of June, 1963, the owner of the Ashton Dry Goods, a woman named Martha Llewellyn, put a sign in the window, "Going out of business." She had run the store for 38 years. Her father had opened it in 1889, 2 years after the railroad arrived. She told the local paper that she could not compete with the chain store at the exit. The freight costs were too high. Her supplier had stopped offering terms. She sold the inventory at a loss and closed the doors. The building sat empty for a year, then became a storage shed for the feed mill. The feed mill itself was next to fail. At 9 a.m. on the 22nd of March, 1966, the owner, a third-generation farmer named Ray Peterson, filed for bankruptcy. The interstate had made it cheaper to truck grain directly to terminals in Kansas City. The local elevator could not match the prices. The mill's silos stood silent for a decade before a salvage company came and cut them down for scrap. How could this have happened? The answer is not simple, but it is consistent. Main Street was built on the economics of proximity and limited choice. Farmers and townspeople bought locally because there was nowhere else to go. The railroad and the highway both gave them options. As soon as those options appeared, the small, independent stores, which operated on thin margins and relied on personal relationships, could not compete with economies of scale. The chains and the malls that came later were not deliberately malicious. They were simply more efficient at moving goods from factory to consumer, but efficiency does not account for community. By 1970, Ashton's Main Street had lost over half of its businesses. The bank remained, but it had been bought by a regional holding company. The doctor had retired and no one replaced him. The hotel was converted into a rooming house. The newspaper moved to a strip mall near the interstate exit. The depot, boarded up and abandoned, was finally torn down in 1973 to make way for a parking lot that was rarely full. The human cost was harder to measure. People in Ashton did not starve. They drove to the exit for groceries, to the county seat for medical care, to the city for entertainment. But the interactions that had once happened on the sidewalk, in the aisles of the dry goods store, on the bench in front of the depot, stopped. The casual conversations that built trust, the informal exchanges of news and advice, the simple act of walking to the store instead of driving to a parking lot, all of that disappeared. The town became a bedroom community, a place where people slept but did not live. The sense of shared fate of being in it together evaporated. Investigators of this phenomenon, urban historians and sociologists who have studied the decline of Main Street, point to several systemic failures. The first was transportation policy. The interstate system, however beneficial for long-distance travel, was designed without regard for the local economies it would displace. The second was retail consolidation. Starting in the 1950s, federal antitrust enforcement weakened, allowing chains to grow into national behemoths. The third was zoning. Many towns, eager to attract tax revenue, allowed strip development along highways, which undercut the traditional downtown. The fourth was the culture of convenience. Americans increasingly preferred one-stop shopping and the anonymity of the chain store to the personal service and inconvenience of the local merchant. But there were also failures of imagination. Town leaders in the 1950s and 1960s often believed that growth was always good and that any new development, even if it bypassed Main Street, was a sign of progress. They did not see that the interstate exit and the strip mall would drain the life from the center. When they did see it, it was often too late. By the time towns tried to revitalize Main Street, the infrastructure, the storefronts, the property ownership had already shifted. The old hardware store had been converted into a thrift shop. The bank building was a beauty parlor. The hotel was condemned. Ashton is not unique. Hundreds of towns, from Vermont to Oregon, from Georgia to Washington, experienced the same story. The specific dates and names differ, but the pattern is repeated. A depot closes, a store closes, a mill closes, the school consolidates, the young people leave. The main street becomes a strip of vacant buildings with plywood over the windows. The town survives, but its identity is lost. The hidden story behind America's small-town main streets is not a mystery. It is a quiet, documented, and largely unexamined transformation. It involves policies, markets, and choices that accumulated over decades. And it raises questions that are still relevant. What is the purpose of a town? Is it an economic unit, a place to exchange goods and services efficiently? Or is it a community, a place where people know each other, support each other, and share a common life? The two are not necessarily incompatible, but the forces that reshaped Main Street in the 20th century treated them as if they were. The result was a landscape of empty storefronts and broken connections. In the next part of this episode, we will follow the story of one town that fought back, that tried to reclaim its Main Street, and that discovered just how difficult it is to reverse a century of decline. But first, we have to understand what was lost. The depot door locked. The train whistle fading into the Kansas prairie. That was the sound of a story ending and a new one, a more complicated one, beginning. At 7 a.m. on the 15th of April, 1989, a group of residents gathered in the empty storefront of the former Ashton Hardware. The building had been vacant for 12 years. The plate glass window was cracked. The floor was covered in dust and dead flies. The group included the mayor, the librarian, the remaining pharmacist, and 3 retired farmers. They had a plan. They called it the Main Street Revitalization Committee. Their goal was simple: bring back the downtown. Their methods were borrowed from a program launched by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 1980, the Main Street Approach, a 4-point strategy of design, promotion, economic restructuring, and organization. It had worked in small towns in the Midwest, in New England, in the Pacific Northwest. They believed it could work in Ashton. The first meeting lasted 3 hours. They made a list. They needed to repair storefronts. They needed to recruit new businesses. They needed to convince the bank to offer low-interest loans. They needed to persuade the city council to invest in sidewalks and streetlights. They set a deadline. By the end of 1990, at least 5 new businesses would open on Main Street. They scheduled monthly meetings. They assigned tasks. They were optimistic. What happened? The committee spent the summer of 1989 applying for grants. They wrote letters to state and federal agencies. They contacted the Kansas Department of Commerce, the National Main Street Center, the local community foundation. They received a small grant of $25,000 from a regional economic development fund. They used the money to hire a consultant, a woman named Carol Benson, who had worked on Main Street projects in 3 other states. She arrived in Ashton in September. She walked the length of Main Street from the old depot site to the grain silos. She took photographs. She interviewed 23 current and former business owners. She produced a report. The report was delivered on the 11th of November 1989. It was 67 pages long. It identified three major obstacles. First, the population of Ashton had declined from a peak of 1,200 in 1950 to just over 700 in 1989. The customer base was too small to support many types of businesses. Second, the remaining residents had grown accustomed to driving to the interstate exit or to the county seat for shopping. Changing that habit would be difficult. Third, the physical condition of the buildings was poor. Many had aging roofs, outdated wiring, and no handicap access. Renovation costs were high. The report recommended targeting a specific niche, businesses that serve the elderly population, such as a pharmacy with delivery, a small grocery with home delivery, and a coffee shop that could become a social hub. It also recommended a marketing campaign to promote the town as a quiet, walkable alternative to the strip malls. The committee accepted the recommendations. They applied for additional funding. They received a second grant of $50,000 from the state's Downtown Revitalization Program. They hired a contractor to repair the most promising storefronts. They painted the wood trim in historically appropriate colors. They replaced the broken windows. They installed new streetlights that matched the 180's originals. They planted trees in concrete planters along the sidewalk. By March of 1990, the work was visible. The hardware store building now had a fresh coat of cream paint with dark brown trim. The old hotel was being converted into 3 apartments and a ground-floor bakery. The bank building was undergoing renovation for a small bakery and a gift shop. The committee held a ribbon-cutting ceremony on the 1st of May. Over 300 people attended. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Main Street Rising." For the first time in 2 decades, there was hope, but the hope was fragile. At 6:30 p.m. on the 3rd of June 1990, the owner of the new bakery, a young couple named Dan and Laura Stevens, called the committee chair with bad news. Their supplier had raised the price of flour by 40%. The bakery's profit margin had vanished. They had only been open for 3 weeks. They asked for a loan to cover operating costs until they could adjust pricing. The committee had no money left. The grant funds had been spent on construction and marketing. The bank, which had initially promised a revolving loan fund, backed out after a change in management. The Stephenses closed the bakery on the 15th of June. The building went back on the market. It remained vacant for another 4 years. How could this have happened? The committee had followed the best practices. They had hired a consultant. They had secured grants. They had created a plan. But they could not control the economic forces that had hollowed out Ashton's downtown in the first place. The chain stores at the interstate exit, a Walmart supercenter and a Kmart, had expanded their offerings. They now sold groceries, hardware, pharmacy items, and home goods. Their prices were lower than any small business could match. The elderly residents of Ashton, many on fixed incomes, could not afford to pay more for the convenience of shopping locally. They drove the 10 miles to the exit. The coffee shop that had opened in the old depot space lasted 6 months. The gift shop closed after a year. The pharmacy hung on because it was the only one in town, but its owner, a man named Harold Bixby, was 68 years old and had no successor. The committee met again on the 10th of September 1990. The mood was somber. The mayor, a woman named Diane Holcomb, read a letter from the National Main Street Center. The letter praised the committee's efforts but noted that the organization could not provide further funding. The center suggested that the committee focus on cultivating private investment. But private investors saw no profit in a shrinking town with declining property values. The committee considered launching a nonprofit that would buy up downtown properties and lease them at reduced rates to startups. They researched the model used by the town of Elgin, Illinois, which had created a downtown development authority. They drafted a proposal for the city council. The council tabled it indefinitely. At 2:15 p.m. on the 22nd of November 1990, the pharmacist Harold Bixby announced that he was closing the pharmacy. He could no longer afford the insurance costs. The town had no pharmacy. Residents now had to drive to the county seat for prescriptions. For the elderly, that meant arranging transportation, often relying on neighbors or the limited senior van service, which ran only twice a week. The closure was a signal. The remaining businesses on Main Street, a barber shop, a thrift store, and a small insurance agency, struggled on, but the downtown was no longer a destination. It was a place to pass through. What went wrong? The question has been asked by dozens of towns across the United States. The Main Street approach had succeeded in many places, but it required a combination of factors that Ashton lacked. It required a strong local economy with enough disposable income to support local businesses. It required a population that was willing to pay a premium for convenience and community. It required leadership that could sustain momentum over years, not months. It required access to capital, either public or private, that could bridge the gap between investment and return. Ashton had none of these in sufficient measure. The deeper failure was systemic. The federal policies that had driven the decline of Main Street, the interstate highway system, the tax laws that encouraged suburban shopping centers, the agricultural policies that consolidated farms and reduced the number of rural residents, were not addressed by local revitalization efforts. Towns like Ashton were trying to swim against a current that had been flowing for 4 decades. The National Main Street Center itself acknowledged that its approach worked best in communities with at least 5,000 residents, a healthy regional economy, and a physical downtown that had not been completely dismantled. Ashton, with its 700 people and its hollowed-out core, was an outlier, but the story does not end there. The committee did not disband. They continued to meet sporadically for another 5 years. They organized a farmers' market that operated on Saturday mornings from May to October. They hosted an annual Christmas parade. They successfully petitioned the county to repave Main Street and add crosswalks. They planted flowers in the empty planters. They maintained the illusion of a living downtown, even as the storefronts remained dark. By 1995, only 3 businesses operated on Main Street: the barber shop, the thrift store, and a tax preparation office that opened only during filing season. Then in 1997, something unexpected happened. A couple from Colorado, retirees with a passion for antiques, bought the old bank building. They opened an antique mall with 40 booths filled with furniture, china, and collectibles. They attracted customers from the interstate exit who saw a billboard advertising the mall. Sales were modest but steady. The couple lived in an apartment above the store. They became fixtures in the community. The antique mall drew enough foot traffic to support a small restaurant, a diner that opened in the former bakery space. The diner served breakfast and lunch. It became a meeting place for local farmers and retirees. For the first time in years, Main Street had a destination. At 8:30 a.m. on the 12th of July 1998, the diner's owner, a local woman named Teresa Morno, noticed something unusual. A group of tourists from Chicago had stopped on their way to the state park. They spent money at the antique mall. They ate breakfast. They bought coffee mugs with the town's name on them. They took photographs of the old depot site. Teresa called the committee chair, Diane Holcomb, who by then was 63 and still serving as mayor. Diane came down to Main Street and saw the tourists. She realized that the town had something that the interstate exit did not: authenticity. The old buildings, the quiet streets, the sense of history. It was not a shopping destination, but it could be a place for people to slow down, to connect, to remember. The committee, revived by this discovery, shifted its strategy. They stopped trying to compete with the chain stores. Instead, they marketed Ashton as a historic village, a stop on the Kansas byways. They applied for a heritage tourism grant. They received $20,000 from the State Historical Society. They installed interpretive signs about the railroad, the grain elevators, the pioneer settlers. They painted a mural on the side of the hardware store building. They held an annual Heritage Days festival in September with a parade, a car show, and a pie-eating contest. The festival drew crowds. In 2000, over 1,000 people attended, more people than the town had residents. The antique mall expanded into an adjacent building. A second-hand bookstore opened. A craft shop followed. By 2005, Main Street had 8 businesses, more than at any time since the 1960s. The bank building was fully occupied. The diner had expanded its hours. A bed and breakfast opened in a restored Victorian house 2 blocks from Main Street. The town still had no pharmacy, no grocery store, and no hardware store. But it had life. The hidden story behind America's small-town main streets is not a single narrative of decline. It is a series of attempts, failures, and occasional recoveries. For every Ashton that managed to find a new niche, there were dozens that did not. The factors that determined success were often beyond local control: proximity to a growing metropolitan area, the presence of a state park or other attraction, the arrival of a remote worker or a creative entrepreneur with capital. But the towns that survived learned to stop trying to rebuild the past. They accepted that Main Street could not return to its 1920s vitality. They instead looked for a new purpose, a reason for people to come, to stay, to care. The story of Ashton is not finished. At 11 a.m. on the 3rd of March 2023, a public meeting was held in the diner. The topic was the future of Main Street. The antique mall had closed in 2019 when the owners retired. The bookstore had moved online. The craft shop had become a real estate office. The diner had a new owner but was struggling. The bed and breakfast had been sold and turned into a private residence. Main Street had 7 businesses, but 3 were seasonal. The question was the same as always: how do we keep this alive? The meeting lasted 2 hours. The participants, 40 residents, debated the same issues that had been debated in 1989. The need for capital, the need for customers, the need for leadership, the need to accept that the town might not grow but could still survive. They decided to apply for a federal grant under the Rural Main Street Program, a new initiative launched in 2012. They agreed to update the 1989 consultant's report. They committed to another decade of effort. The meeting ended at 1:15 p.m. The participants walked out onto Main Street. The street was quiet. The sky was clear. The old depot site was a gravel lot with a flagpole. The grain silos were gone, replaced by a row of houses built in the 1970s. The hardware store building stood empty, its windows boarded, but the diner was open. The barber shop was open. A new business, a pottery studio run by a young couple who had moved from Denver during the pandemic, had just opened its doors. The owner, a woman named Sarah, was sweeping the sidewalk. She smiled at the people leaving the meeting. She said hello. At 1:17 p.m. on the 3rd of March 2023, a car pulled into the gravel lot. A man in his late 40s got out. He was wearing a polo shirt with the logo of a national nonprofit that works on rural economic development. He walked into the diner. He asked for the meetings were over. They were, but someone gave him the notes. He read them. He nodded. He said he had seen many towns like Ashton. He said the key was not to try to be what you once were, but to be what you could become. He left at 1:45 p.m. No one knows what he recommended to his organization. What remains is the question. The town survives. The story continues. The hidden story behind America's small-town main streets is not a closed book. It is a living archive of decisions made and unmade, of economic forces and human resilience. It is a reminder that towns are not just collections of buildings and businesses. They are networks of relationships, trust, and shared memory. When those networks break, the physical street can still be there, but the main street is gone. When they are repaired, even imperfectly, the street lives again. The railroad no longer stops at Ashton. The passenger trains stopped running in 1967. The depot was demolished. But the street itself, the strip of asphalt between the antique streetlights, still holds the imprint of 100 years of motion. The footsteps of farmers, shoppers, children, and travelers, the sound of bells and horns and conversation, the rhythm of a community that refused to disappear. What happened to Ashton is what happened to hundreds of towns across America. It is not a mystery. It is a story of choices, of unintended consequences, and of the stubborn persistence of place. The next time you drive through a small town on a state highway, slow down, look at the storefronts. The ones that are still open are the result of decisions made by people who believed that Main Street was worth saving. The ones that are boarded up are the result of decisions made by people who believed something else. Both are evidence of the same thing, a nation built on movement, on change, and on the uneasy balance between commerce and community. The episode does not end here. There is still the matter of the unseen, the unnamed, the stories that never made it into the consultant reports. There is the barber who kept cutting hair at the same chair for 50 years. There is the farm widow who donated her house to the Historical Society. There is the teenager who left for the city and never returned, and the one who came back to open the pottery studio. The hidden story is not one story. It is 1,000 stories, all happening at once, on main streets that are both dying and being reborn every day across the country. At 7:15 a.m. on the 14th of September 1985, a fire alarm sounded at the Masonic Lodge on Main Street in Baynesville, Ohio. The fire department arrived within 4 minutes. The lodge was fully engulfed. The flames spread to the adjoining hardware store, then to the dry goods shop, then to the row house next door. By 8:20, the entire block was burning. Firefighters from 3 neighboring counties were called in. They had to draw water from a creek a mile away because the town's hydrant system had been decommissioned in 1970. The fire burned until noon. When it was over, 6 buildings were destroyed on Main Street. 4 more were damaged beyond repair. What happened? The fire was caused by faulty wiring in the lodge's basement. The building had been constructed in 1903. The wiring had been installed in 1948. No inspection had been performed since 1960. The town had no building codes. The insurance payouts covered only a fraction of the losses. The hardware store owner, a man named Frank Tuttle, had let his policy lapse 6 months earlier. He lost everything. The dry goods shop owner, a woman named Margaret Sims, had insurance, but the payout was tied up in litigation for 3 years. She never reopened. Baynesville was not a struggling town in 1985. It had a population of 2,300. Main Street had 21 businesses. There was a grocery, a pharmacy, a bank, 2 barbershops, a diner, a cafe, a furniture store, a plumbing supply shop, a feed store, a laundromat, a movie theater, a shoe repair, a hardware store, a dry goods shop, a doctor's office, a dentist, a lawyer, a real estate office, the Masonic Lodge, and the town hall. The town had a manufacturing plant on the outskirts that employed 400 people. The plant made parts for farm equipment. It was owned by a family from Chicago. The town seemed stable. After the fire, the town faced a choice. The burned block was salvageable, the foundations were intact, the lots could be cleared and rebuilt, but the insurance money was slow. The town council, led by a part-time mayor named Bill Kincaid, voted to apply for federal disaster assistance. They were denied. The fire was not a disaster in the federal definition, it was a localized event. The government would not rebuild the block. The council then considered a bond issue. The residents voted it down in a special election. They did not want to raise taxes. The banks in the county were hesitant to lend for commercial construction in a small town. The lot sat empty for 5 years. Weeds grew. The concrete foundations became a hazard. Children played on them. Teenagers drank beer on them at night. In 1990, the town cleared the lots with a bulldozer borrowed from the county highway department. They graded the land. They planted grass. They put up a sign, Bainesville Community Park coming soon. The park never came. The town had no money for benches, playground equipment, or landscaping. The grass mowed twice a summer by volunteers. The lot became a field. By 1995, the manufacturing plant announced it was closing. The farm equipment market had shifted. The plant was outdated. The Chicago family sold the building to a logistics company that used it for storage. The employment dropped to 40 people. The remaining businesses on Main Street began to close. The grocery store closed in 1997. The pharmacy closed in 1999. The movie theater closed in 20 Rune. The bank closed in 20 Roffer. By 2010, Main Street had 6 businesses: a barbershop, a diner, a used car lot, a liquor store, a laundromat, and a thrift shop run by the church. What investigators found when they looked back at Bainesville was not a single cause of decline but a chain of events that began with the fire. The fire was not preventable in the sense that the wiring was old. But the lack of inspections, the lack of a building code, the lack of a fire hydrant system, these were systemic failures. The town had not invested in infrastructure for decades. The fire was a symptom, not a cause. The deeper question was whether Bainesville could have been saved. The town's location was not advantageous. It was 40 miles from the nearest interstate. It had no railroad. It had no river. It relied on the manufacturing plant, which was owned by an out-of-state family with no ties to the community. When the plant closed, the town had no alternative economic base. The fire accelerated a process that was already underway. But the story does not end with decline. At 9 a.m. on the 2nd of May, 2018, a meeting was held at the Bainesville Diners Club, the old diner that had survived. The topic was a proposal from a developer who wanted to build a solar farm on the old plant site. The developer offered the town a lease payment of $10,000 per year for 20 years, plus a community fund of $50,000 up front. The town council, now led by a younger mayor named Brian Harper, accepted. The solar farm was built in 2009. It now powers about 600 homes in the county. The lease payment allowed the town to fix the roof of the town hall, repave the parking lot, and install a small playground on the old burned block. The lot that had been empty for over 30 years finally got a swing set and a slide. In 2021, a family from Columbus bought the old hardware store building, which had been converted into a residential unit, and moved in. They started a small online business selling handmade furniture. They are the first new residents under 40 in Bainesville in 15 years. The hidden story behind Bainesville's Main Street is not a parable of failure. It is a story of adaptation, of accepting that the past cannot be resurrected but the future can still be shaped. The town will never regain its 1985 population. The movie theater is now a church. The bank is a private residence, but the diner still serves coffee. The barbershop still cuts hair. The thrift shop still sells donated clothes. And the solar farm is a quiet, steady source of income. What remains is the question of whether such adaptation is possible everywhere. At 10:30 a.m. on the 18th of November 1998, a train derailed on the outskirts of Pembroke, Nebraska. The train was carrying grain. The derailment caused a fire that burned for 2 days. The fire destroyed the grain elevator, which was the town's main employer. The elevator was not insured. The owner, a man named Carl Benson, had been planning to sell it to a cooperative, but the deal fell through. After the fire, he had nothing. He moved to Texas. The town of Pembroke, population 900, never recovered. The difference between Bainesville and Pembroke is not luck, it is timing. Bainesville had a manufacturing plant that could be converted into a solar farm. Pembroke had a grain elevator that could not be replaced. The elevator was its only industry. Without it, the town had no reason to exist. The railroad that passed through Pembroke still runs, but it no longer stops. The station closed in 1976. The tracks are used for through traffic only. At 2 p.m. on the 12th of June 2003, a truck loaded with frozen food crashed into the only gas station on Main Street in Pembroke. The gas station had been the last place to buy fuel, food, and supplies within 10 miles. The crash destroyed the pumps. The station owner, a widow named Gladys Turner, did not have the money to rebuild. She closed the business. The nearest gas station was then 20 miles away. The convenience store that had been attached to the station also closed. The town's remaining residents had to drive 20 miles for groceries. Many of them were elderly and could not drive. The town's population dropped to 400 by 2010. The system that failed Pembroke was not simply a derailment or a truck crash. It was the cumulative erosion of economic viability. The town had no hospital, no pharmacy, no school, no post office. The gas station was the last thread. When it broke, the town became uninhabitable for anyone without a car. The hidden story of Main Street in Pembroke is the story of the loss of essential services. The street is still there, the buildings are still standing, but the life is gone. At 8 a.m. on the 22nd of September 2019, a busload of tourists stopped in Pembroke. They were on a road trip following the Oregon Trail historical markers. They expected to find a town, Instead, they found a ghost. The diner was boarded up. The post office was a blue metal box on a pole. The few houses that were occupied had no children. The tourists took photographs of the boarded storefronts. They posted them on social media. A caption read, "America's dying main streets." The post went viral. It brought attention to Pembroke but not investment. The question that remains unanswered is whether tourism can save such towns. Ashton, Kansas used heritage tourism to survive. Pembroke had no heritage to market. The Oregon Trail passed nearby, but the town itself had no historic sites, no museums, no architecture worth preserving. Main Street was a collection of plain utilitarian buildings from the 1-0s, nothing special, nothing worth stopping for. What investigators of small-town decline have found is that the most successful recoveries share a common factor, a resource that cannot be moved. A river, a mountain, a national park, a college, a hospital, a factory that the owner will not sell. Ashton had the state park and the railroad history. Baynesville had the solar potential. Pembroke had nothing. The resource is not always obvious. In some towns, it is a local entrepreneur with connections and capital. In others, it is a grant that arrives at the right time. But in the towns that never recover, the problem is usually the absence of any anchor that can be leveraged. At 11:15 a.m. on the 7th of August, 2012, a fire destroyed the only grocery store in the small town of Midville, New Mexico. The grocery store had been operated by the Ortega family for 3 generations. The fire was caused by a faulty refrigerator compressor. The insurance payout was enough to rebuild, but the Ortega family decided not to. The father had died a year earlier. The children had moved to Albuquerque. They had no desire to return. The building was demolished. The lot became a parking area for the church next door. The town of Midville, population 300, now has no grocery store within 30 miles. The elderly residents rely on a weekly delivery service from a food bank. Main Street has a bar, a laundromat, and a taxidermy shop. The bar is the only social gathering place. The taxidermy shop sells online. What happened to Midville is not an accident. It is a pattern repeated across rural America. The loss of a family business is often the final blow. The business is not just a source of goods. It is a source of credit, a source of information, a source of community identity. When the Ortega family closed the grocery store, they took with them the town's ability to function independently. The failure was not the fire, it was the succession. No one else in the town had the capital or the desire to run a grocery store. The hidden story behind America's small-town main streets is therefore not only about economics, it is about demographics. The people who would have taken over the family business are gone. They moved to cities for education and careers. They did not return. The towns that survive are often those where someone, either a retiree returning after years away or a new arrival from outside, steps in to fill the gap. In Ashton, it was the young couple from Denver who opened the pottery studio. In Baynesville, it was the family from Columbus who started the furniture business. In Midville, no one came. At 9:45 a.m. on the 17th of March, 2020, the Main Street Program of the state of North Carolina issued a report on the condition of small-town commercial districts. The report found that over 60% of towns with populations under 1,000 had lost at least one essential business in the past decade. The report recommended a new approach. Instead of trying to fill empty storefronts with traditional retail, towns should focus on creating spaces for services, for creative work, for community gathering. The report cited examples like the pottery studio in Ashton and the solar farm in Baynesville. But it acknowledged that these success stories were exceptions. The report also noted a troubling pattern. The towns that needed help the most were the ones least likely to apply for it. The application process for federal grants, state loans, and nonprofit assistance required time, expertise, and administrative capacity that many small towns lacked. The part-time mayors and volunteer councils were overwhelmed. They did not know how to write grant proposals. They did not have internet access. They did not have email. The system that was supposed to help them was not designed for them. This is the quiet crisis behind the hidden story. At 2:30 p.m. on the 8th of December 2021, a consultant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation visited the town of Oswego, Wisconsin. Oswego had a population of 400. Main Street had 5 businesses, but 3 were for sale. The consultant spent 2 hours walking the street. He took notes. He met with the mayor, a retired teacher named Linda Harris. He asked her what the town needed. She said a grocery store. He asked her what the town had to offer. She said a historic opera house that had been closed for 40 years. He suggested that the town try to restore the opera house as a cultural venue. Linda Harris said that would cost $1 million. The consultant said towns like Oswego had to think bigger. Linda Harris said the town had no money. The consultant left at 4 p.m. The opera house is still closed. The hidden story is not a single narrative. It is 1,000 stories, each with its own timeline, its own cast of characters, its own missed opportunities and surprising successes. At 6:30 a.m. on the 11th of April, 2022, a man named David Chen drove into the town of Marigold, Oklahoma. He was looking for a place to start a business. He had a background in coffee roasting. He had worked in Seattle, then in Portland. He wanted a slower pace. He found Marigold Online, a town of 700 with a historic depot and a vacant building. He bought the building for $30,000. He renovated it for another $100,000. He opened a coffee roastery and cafe in June 2012. Within a year, he was selling beans online to customers across the country. He hired 2 local employees. He started a weekly farmers market in the parking lot. He became the new anchor of Main Street. The story of Marigold is not yet complete. The cafe is successful, but the town still has no pharmacy, no grocery store, no hardware store. The nearest hospital is 40 miles away. The school district is consolidated with 2 other towns. But Main Street now has a reason for people to stop. The cafe is a meeting place. The farmers market brings in customers from surrounding communities. David Chen has become a local celebrity, not because he wanted to be, but because he filled a gap that no one else could fill. What does this tell us? The hidden story behind America's small-town main streets is not a tragedy, though it contains many tragic elements. It is not a triumph, though there are moments of triumph. It is a living archive of human decision, economic pressure, and the slow, unglamorous work of survival. The towns that last are those that find a way to adapt not by recreating the past, but by accepting a new purpose. The towns that fade are those that cannot. At 10 a.m. on the 4th of July, 2023, the celebration on Main Street in Ashton, Kansas included a parade, a band, and a pie contest. The pottery studio was open. The diner was full. The barber shop had a line. The festival attracted 2,000 people, more than the town's entire population. The nonprofit consultant who had visited in March did not return. His organization later approved a grant for $25,000 to update the 1989 report. The town council voted to use the money for a feasibility study for a community grocery co-op. The study is not yet complete. The episode does not end here. The hidden story is still being written. In every small town with a boarded-up storefront and a flickering streetlight, there is a decision being made, a person taking a risk, a family choosing to stay or leave. The story of Main Street is the story of America. It is not a single story. It is 1,000 stories, all happening at once, all worth telling. At 8:15 a.m. on the 12th of September 2015, a new 4-lane highway bypass opened 2 miles east of Riverton, Illinois. The bypass was part of a state project to reduce travel time between Springfield and Decatur. The old highway, which ran directly through Riverton's Main Street, was reclassified as a local road. The town's population was 1,200. Main Street had a diner, a hardware store, a pharmacy, a barbershop, a bakery, and a gas station. The gas station had been operated by the same family since 1958. Within 6 months of the bypass opening, the gas station closed. The owner said the traffic count dropped by 70%. Without the through traffic, the station could not cover its costs. The bakery followed a year later. The pharmacy lasted 2 more years, then sold its prescription files to a chain in Springfield. The hardware store closed in 2019. By 2021, Main Street had the diner, the barbershop, and 3 empty storefronts. What happened in Riverton is not a mystery. It was predicted. During the public hearings for the bypass in 2013, the town's mayor, a retired farmer named James Crowley, testified that the bypass would kill Main Street. He presented traffic counts, sales tax data, and a study from a university economist. The state transportation department listened. The project went forward anyway. The rationale was simple. The bypass would save drivers an average of 3 minutes per trip. The economic benefit to the region was calculated at millions of dollars in reduced fuel costs and travel time. The cost to Riverton was not calculated. There was no requirement to do so. The hidden story behind America's small-town main streets often begins not with a fire or a family decision, but with a state agency's map. Roads are drawn. Routes are straightened. Towns that once functioned as waypoints become detours. The loss of traffic is not gradual, it is immediate. In Riverton, the first week after the bypass opened, the diner owner reported a 60% drop in lunch customers. The regulars still came, but the truck drivers and traveling salesmen disappeared. The diner reduced its hours. The owner stopped making pies. The menu shrank. The decline was not a slow bleed. It was a severing. Investigators in this case are not crash investigators. They are economists, historians, and planners who study the long-term effects of infrastructure decisions. In 2022, a researcher from the University of Illinois published a paper on bypass impacts on small towns in the Midwest. The study examined 43 towns that had been bypassed between 1990 and 2010. In 36 of those towns, Main Street business districts experienced a net decline in revenue within 2 years. In 12 towns, the decline exceeded 50%. The study noted that towns with a strong local institution, such as a hospital, a college, or a county seat, were more likely to survive. Towns that relied primarily on highway traffic were almost certain to decline. Riverton was in the second category. It had no hospital, no college, no county seat. It had only Main Street and the highway. The systems that failed Riverton were not one system but several. The state transportation department's cost-benefit analysis did not include the social cost of lost community businesses. The town's zoning code did not allow for new uses of the empty storefronts. The state's economic development programs required matching funds that the town could not provide. The bank that held the mortgages on the buildings was based in Chicago and had no interest in redevelopment. The federal government's assistance programs for rural communities were available, but the application process required a full-time grant writer. Riverton had a part-time mayor and a volunteer council. They did not apply. At 10:30 a.m. on the 3rd of March, 2018, a group of residents gathered in the basement of the Riverton Methodist Church. They had invited a representative from the local nonprofit Main Street, Iowa. The representative, a woman named Sarah Oakes, had worked with a dozen small towns in the state. She told the group that the first step was to conduct a market analysis. The group had no money for a market analysis. Sarah Oakes said they could do it themselves by surveying residents and businesses. The group tried. They distributed paper surveys at the diner, the church, and the post office. Only 47 surveys were returned. The results showed that residents wanted a grocery store, a hardware store, and a pharmacy. None of those businesses were likely to open in a town of 1,200 with declining traffic. The group disbanded after 6 months. The human consequences in Riverton are not dramatic. No one died, but the quality of life eroded. The elderly residents could no longer walk to the pharmacy. They had to drive 20 miles to Springfield. The residents who did not own cars became dependent on neighbors. The diner remained open, but it served only breakfast and lunch. The barbershop still had customers, but they were mostly the same men who had been going there for 20 years. The empty storefronts became a visual symbol of decline. Property values on Main Street fell by an average of 30%. The town's tax base shrank. The school district, which already had declining enrollment, lost more students. In 2023, the school board voted to consolidate with a nearby district. Riverton's elementary school was closed. The building is now used for storage by the county highway department. How could this have happened? The question is not rhetorical, but it is difficult to answer without assigning blame. The blame does not belong to any single person. The state transportation department followed its procedures. The mayor testified but could not stop the project. The residents voted in local elections, but the town had little political power at the state level. The problem was structural. The economic system values efficiency and speed over community cohesion. The bypass saved minutes. The cost was measurable in dollars but not in the slow erosion of a town's ability to sustain itself. At 7 p.m. on the 16th of December, 2022, a different kind of story unfolded in the town of Kingsley, Michigan. Kingsley had a population of 1,500. Its Main Street had lost its grocery store in 2009, its hardware store in 2012, and its pharmacy in 2005. The town had a diner, a bar, a church, and an abandoned movie theater. In 2020, a couple from Traverse City, both retired architects, bought the theater for $40,000. They spent 2 years and $200,000 restoring it. They reopened it as a live performance venue and movie house in December 2022. In 2022, the theater hosted 32 events, including concerts, plays, and film screenings. The couple hired 4 part-time employees. They started a weekly trivia night that drew people from surrounding towns. The theater did not replace the grocery store or the pharmacy, but it gave Main Street a reason for people to come in the evening. The diner extended its hours. The bar began serving food. A local entrepreneur opened a small cafe in one of the empty storefronts. The story of Kingsley is not a full recovery. The town still lacks essential services. But it is an example of what the National Trust for Historic Preservation calls creative placemaking. The theater did not solve the economic problem. It solved the social problem. It gave people a reason to stay. It gave the town an identity beyond the bypass. The architects who restored the theater did not do it for profit. They did it because they believed in the value of a gathering place. The town's government did not help. The project was entirely private. The couple used their savings. They did not apply for grants. They did not wait for permission. They acted. This is the other side of the hidden story. For every town that fades, there is a town that finds a new purpose. The purpose is rarely the same as the old one. Main Street does not have to be a place where people shop for groceries. It can be a place where people attend a concert, meet a friend, or start a business that sells to the internet. The pottery studio in Ashton, the furniture business in Baynesville, the coffee roastery in Marigold, and the theater in Kingsley all share one thing. They were started by people who saw an opportunity that no one else saw. They were willing to take a risk. They were willing to accept that Main Street would never look like it did in 1950. At 9 a.m. on the 5th of January, 2024, the Town Council of Riverton, Illinois, voted to sell the empty hardware store building to a developer from Springfield. The developer plans to convert the building into a laundromat and a self-storage facility. The council approved the sale unanimously. The mayor, who is now James Crowley's daughter, said it was better than having the building rot. The laundromat will open in the summer. The self-storage units will follow. Riverton's Main Street will have a new anchor, but it will not be the anchor that residents once knew. The laundry machines will hum. The storage units will fill with furniture and boxes. People will come to wash clothes and leave. It is not a revival. It is a compromise, but it is something. The hidden story behind America's small-town main streets is not a single narrative. It is a collection of compromises, adaptations, losses, and occasional gains. At 2:45 p.m. on the 22nd of April 2024, a farmer in eastern Colorado drove his pickup truck down the empty main street of a town called Plains City. The town had a grain elevator, a post office, a church, and 8 empty buildings. The farmer was looking for a place to park his truck. He parked in front of what used to be a drugstore. He remembered buying candy there as a child. The building had no roof. The windows were boarded. The farmer sat for a few minutes, then drove away. The grain elevator was still operating. The post office was still open. But Main Street was a memory. The farmer later told a reporter that the town had been dying for 40 years. The only question was when the last building would fall. That last building has not fallen yet. It might not fall for another decade, but the trajectory is clear. The towns that survive are those that find a reason to exist beyond the highway, beyond the grocery store, beyond the past. The towns that fade are those that cannot. The hidden story is still being written. Every day a new timeline begins. A store closes, a theater opens, a bypass connects, a farmer parks, and Main Street in all its quiet desperation and occasional hope endures. At 2 p.m. on the 10th of November 2023, a research team from the University of Kansas arrived in the town of Cedar Creek, Nebraska. The team consisted of 3 graduate students and a professor of urban planning. They were conducting a case study on small-town economic resilience, funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Cedar Creek had a population of 600. Its main street had lost its last retail store in 2008. The hardware store had closed in 2014, the grocery store in 2010, and the pharmacy in 2006. What remained was a gas station, a diner, a church, a post office, and the Cedar Creek Opera House. The Opera House was built in 1890. By 2015, it had been vacant for 20 years. Then a local nonprofit raised money to restore it. They reopened it in 2017 as a community center. It hosted a farmers market every Saturday from May to October. It held wedding receptions, craft fairs, and an annual quilt show. The team spent 3 days interviewing residents, the nonprofit board, and the town's part-time mayor. They found that the Opera House did not replace the grocery store, but it drew people into town. The diner saw a modest increase in lunch customers on market days. The gas station sold more snacks and drinks. The town's tax revenue from prepared food and fuel stabilized. What happened? The team's final report, published in March 2024, documented a wider pattern. Across the Great Plains, towns that survived the retail collapse were often those that found a new purpose for their historic buildings. The buildings themselves became assets. The Opera House in Cedar Creek cost $200,000 to restore. Half came from state historic preservation grants. The other half came from local donations and a memorial gift from a former resident who had moved to Denver. The town did not apply for federal economic development funds. They did not have the staff to write the grants. Instead, they relied on local volunteers and a board that met twice a month. The researchers called it low-capacity resilience. It was not a strategy that could be replicated easily. It depended on the persistence of a few individuals. The systems that failed Cedar Creek were the same ones that failed Riverton. The highway bypass did not hit Cedar Creek directly. The town was already off the main interstate, 30 miles from the nearest 4-lane road. The decline was slower, more gradual. The grocery store closed because the owner retired and no one bought the business. The hardware store closed because the big box stores in the county seat, 40 miles away, offered lower prices. The pharmacy closed because the local pharmacist could not afford to stock expensive drugs under the reimbursement rates from Medicare Part D. Each closure was rational. Each closure was a small death. The cumulative effect was that Main Street became a place to pass through, not a place to stop. How could this have happened? The research team argued that the problem was not just economic. It was cultural. The town had lost its sense of itself as a destination. People drove to the county seat for groceries, hardware, and medicine. They no longer had a reason to linger. The Opera House gave them a reason. It was not enough to reverse the decline. It was enough to slow it. The team calculated that the Opera House generated an additional $200,000 in annual spending within Cedar Creek. That was not enough to support a full-time grocery store. But it kept the diner open. It kept the gas station solvent. It kept the town from becoming a ghost town. The human consequences in Cedar Creek were not dramatic. No one starved.